So companies in the very beginning, they feel like they're gonna be making so much money off internal techs, right? They feel like it's gonna be a gold mine.
Good morning, Diego. Many of the people we speak to on a daily basis, property management company owners or property management companies in general, right? They work with internal techs. We've worked with a few of those companies. We've coordinated maintenance for a few of those companies. So there's, I guess my question would be, Diego, what's the biggest difference that between coordinating maintenance for internal techs versus third-party techs?
Yeah, so the biggest difference is if you're thinking of hiring your own internal techs, they belong to you, right? They're part of your team. You have to pay them. They're under a W-2 um, contract. You have to pay their taxes. So they're basically your team players, right? Now, most of the internal techs, they're not licensed, right? So they can only handle handyman type of things unless you want to get someone that can do a licensed type of job, but by then the pricing goes up severely. So most companies they have internal techs who are basically handyman individuals who do everything, handyman related inspections, sometimes rekis depending on the city. But yeah, that's basically the difference. They're your vendors, your team, your techs.
Okay. So obviously there are some pros to working with internal techs, right? So I'm thinking more revenue, more control of the pricing, and so on, keeping costs low for your owners. But what are some of the disadvantages of working with internal techs?
Yeah, so there's definitely some pros and some cons. Let's start with the cons first. The cons, you have to manage these individuals, right? And what we've seen is when you have internal techs, it is harder for team members, especially if they don't have experience, to really control the internal techs, controlling their time, controlling their hours, and making sure that they're being as efficient as possible. Since a lot of companies don't have SOPs, they don't have processes in place, what ends up happening is you have internal techs who decide when they're going to do a job. And depending on their area, depending on what they like, what they don't like. And so, what ends up happening, and we've seen this across the board, is internal techs have a super high turnaround time, which is over 14 days. Yes, they might get to the property fast to do an inspection, but they're very slow when it comes to actually getting the job done, right? So that is what we've seen. You still have to pay them for their time. So if you dispatch them to a property to go and check out an issue, and let's say they can't fix that issue, well, they're going to charge either way because it is their time, and they charge by hour.
Mhm.
So
But other vendors, third-party vendors, they're sometimes also slow. So what's the difference?
yeah, well, if first of all, if the company doesn't have SOPs and processes, they're going to be slow no matter what. But it gets worse with time if you're not pushing on your internal techs to meet expectations like they would with your vendors, right? What we've seen is sometimes you push the vendors much more than you push the internal techs because you're working with that person constantly, right? So you're afraid of hurting their feelings, afraid of have building a bad relationship, and that's usually where it goes wrong. Since you're not setting the right expectations, they end up delaying a lot of the jobs and just choosing when to work and so on.
Okay, cool. So if you have internal techs, what are some of the traits that you never let an internal tech do? So basically, my question is, what are the areas that most internal techs cover versus the ones that they don't cover?
Yeah, so anything small handyman related, that's what an internal tech can handle. And that's a good chunk of the workload, right? A lot of the work orders that come in, they're small little things. So you want them to do a little bit of everything, but little things. You don't want to send out an internal tech for an HVAC system, for example, that's going to need to be licensed. For plumbing, they can handle small plumbing things like maybe the toilet flapper, it's not sealing correctly and they need to replace that piece. Those little things that don't require a license, they can go ahead and handle. But anything where you're doubting if you need a license or not, don't send out an internal tech. That's just going to cause you to get a trip fee from the internal tech because you're going to have to pay for that hour, and then you're going to delay the job because now you're going to need to send out a plumber. So try to keep that fine line very well defined so that your team is not wasting time
Yeah.
and money.
Yeah, that's correct. And what about cash flow? So let's say if you're a property management company, you're considering starting to work with internal techs. How does it affect the cash flow of a company?
It actually affects it quite a lot, because you're going to have to front everything that the internal tech buys, right? So when it comes to, and this is something that most companies don't even think about, right? You're going to need to buy material, depending on the type of job. And so the internal tech is going to charge you to go to the property. They're going to charge you to go to get the material, the supplies to do that job, and then they'll go and do the job, right? And so they'll charge you for the time it takes them. So you're going to have to pay all of that up front to the internal tech, right? Because they expect weekly payment, and they're not like a vendor that they'll wait 2, 3, 4 weeks. They expect that payment to come right up front. So that's going to be their time and the materials that you'll need to consider. And yes, it is cheaper to pay an internal tech rather than to pay a handyman, but it's not that much of a difference. If you break it down, like if you go deep into the numbers, it's not that much of a difference in cost. We're talking about like a 15 to 20% savings on the owner side. But the negative side is when you do get those trip fees for the internal tech not being able to do the job. And if you're a company that doesn't charge the owners for trip fees, that's where you eat part of the cost. So you eat part of your earnings.
Okay. Well, yeah, okay. So you eat part of the earnings, but I'm sure that, most companies also earn more, so it kind of offsets that cost. Because why else would property management companies do it, right?
So companies in the very beginning, they feel like they're gonna be making so much money off internal techs, right? They feel like it's gonna be a gold mine, but it's yes, it has its advantages. You will make money off the internal techs, but it's not as glamorous as you think. The earning percentage is not as high. So a lot of companies, what they actually do is they either mark up their invoices, which is a really good way of getting revenue. So if they're using just third party vendors, they will mark up either 5, 10, we've seen 15, 20% in the industry, right? And they either disclose that with their owners or they don't disclose that. So that alone makes more revenue than the internal tax. But the other thing to consider here is yes, you are making money on the internal tax, but you're also having to front your money until you get paid. So it is you are making a good amount of profit, but you're also having to use a lot of your own money to front, especially if you're starting to front the startup of having an internal tech.
Yeah. Yeah. So if a property management company has internal techs, but they do not have any rebate or markups in place on the jobs that a tech cannot perform, then I probably think that if you would have a rebate or a markup in place for everything, it would probably be even more beneficial then. So it would not count. Let's say, for example, a company works with internal techs where they can, but then also mark up and have a rebate in place for the companies that for the jobs that are not performed by their internal techs. That is probably the most profitable. But If it's a choice and they go with internal text and don't make any money on HVAC and whatever it is, then I can see that actually the percentage or the markup would be more because you're talking about way more jobs and higher ticket items too.
Exactly. Exactly. And that is something to consider. And that is one of the reasons why we see that companies that surpass 400, 500 units, if number one, most companies don't have SOPs and processes in place, right? So they start to struggle managing the internal techs. And since they're employees and they're making them revenue, they don't want friction with them, but also that not having that friction with them makes the service worse. So you have higher tenant complaints, you have higher owner complaints, and then you also have that internal issue with them. So what we've seen is companies that get past 400, 500 doors, that's where they start to notice a lot of issues that surface from the internal techs.
Mhm.
Also because you have so many more work orders and your internal tech can only do so many work orders, so that's where you usually get two or even three more internal techs, and then now it's more of a headache. And we're not even talking about the mistakes that surface with internal techs yet. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But once you start to see those headaches, that's where most companies start to think, oh shoot, maybe I went the wrong route. Maybe I should just use third party vendors. Once the company reaches 700 doors to 900 doors, that's usually when they switch back to internal text because it has gotten so out of hand. And we've seen that, right? We've seen companies that reach 1,000 doors and they want to go back to just using third party vendors for every single job because they've seen the inefficiencies. They've seen that they don't make that much money compared to utilizing third party vendors and either marking up or having a rebate. So yeah, it is something to consider. It's great for the beginning because you get that extra money in the bank, but later on it is going to start to have a lot of issues.
All right. So what are some of those mistakes?
Well, this is where it starts to get really, really crappy if your internal texts don't have guidelines. Let's say you send out an internal tech to take care of a plumbing job, right? And it's a broken line. Depending on the city you're in, depending on the state, most internal techs cannot play with the lines. And some of them know how to do it. They can replace a line, but they're not licensed to do it. So what one of the worst stories that I've seen was an internal tech, they replaced a line. That line ruptured from the freeze, the Texas freeze that happened a couple of years back, and the insurance was not paying for it because they were not licensed and they messed up on the job. You could see how they soldered the line. It wasn't done correctly, and that is one of the reasons why it ruptured. And so that entire home flooded. The tenant moved out of the home. So those are some of the things that you need to consider because if the insurance doesn't pay for that, then they're going to look at your insurance and they're going to see if you're liable for that mistake. In this particular case, even the insurance for the tech didn't want to take care of it because they were not licensed and they were doing something that they shouldn't have been doing. So the company needed to end up eating the cost to rebuild that home, and it was a massive loss. So that being said, if you do have internal techs, make sure that they're not handling things that they're not supposed to be handling. We've seen internal techs handling HVAC issues and adding Freon. They're not supposed to do it if they're not licensed. So avoid those type of issues. Don't go that route. Yes, you'll save some money in the short end and you'll make the owner happy in the short end, but I guarantee you it will one day it will come back to bite you.
So Diego, what's the verdict here? What if you had a property management company? Would you use internal text? If yes, what for? If no, why wouldn't you use them?
So, since I've seen the scalability of internal techs and I've seen what happens after you get past 1,000 units, no, I would not use internal techs at all because I know it's not a scalable way to go. And also, there's a lot on the line. You're liable for a lot of their issues.
Mhm.
Now, if you do have processes in place and you have a strong hand basically and you know you're going to be behind the internal techs to make sure that they're doing things in a timely manner up to your expectations and you're just getting started, you let's say you have 100 units, 200, it is a good source of income, but just make sure that you're doing things correctly, that they're not doing licensed jobs if they're not licensed, and just making sure that you're behind them. Yeah, it is a great source of income. But personally, no, I would not go that route. I would rather go the route of either marking up or the rebate, setting that in place. It's going to give you more revenue and less headaches.
Yeah. All right, and then there's still the choice of you can still use internal tech for smaller stuff like yearly inspections or even rekeys is something that we've seen a lot as well because they're so flexible and they're needed and there's no reason to pay a handyman or a rekey guy for all of that. Especially rekeys, I cannot emphasize this enough. Something we've seen a lot is where a company becomes reliant on the rekey guy because they have all of the master keys over the years they collected it all, and then now you're kind of stuck with that person too. So in terms of rekeys, why not keep it in house? Great. In terms of inspections, why not keep it in house? I think that's perfect. For me, all of the rest, no, I think you're much better off with a third party vendor. It's capitalism. One is not performing, now you can easily switch without any drama because when you have internal text, there's going to be drama involved. For me, no, third party text, 100%, except for inspections and rekeys. I think that's a great middle way there. All right,
Yeah,
Diego.
definitely. Really, really
Yeah.
quick. I do want to make it clear for everybody listening when Tom mentions Rikis, it's only in certain areas in certain cities where license is not needed because there are areas like Texas where you are required to have a license to do so. So
Mhm.
again, unless they're licensed, do not utilize them for Rikis if the law requires it.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for clarifying that. Thanks so much, guys. See you next time.
Thank you guys.